Good.
There we go. Okay, so hey Jim, how are you doing?
Real good, Rafa. It's great to be with you today.
All right, great. I'm super honored to have you on. And well, I would like for us to explore together the ancient civilizations, talk a little bit about the gods of the old times, and
Ah,
perhaps even the origins or the proto origins of our own current civilization and what we might owe
hmm
ones that came before. Um,
yes,
so
yes.
let me just ask you a little thing. Um, how did you how did you become interested in the exploration of ancient past?
When I started, when I graduated from college and then I went on to seminary, I became a Protestant minister back in 1972 or so. And I had the idea, it was a mistaken idea, but I had the idea that my life was going to become this great spiritual journey surrounded by people. I thought that's what the church was all about. And we were going to be studying all these, and I was going to be having a community of people around me who were interested in asking the big questions. Who are we? And what gives life meaning? Where did we come from? How did we begin our journey? Why does life seem so difficult at times? And as I was going into with all these ideas, I soon discovered, like all of us do, that life just becomes busy. We get surrounded by, even in the church, by the politics of the church and by the traditions and by the doctrines and the dogmas and the arguments and all this kind of thing. And pretty soon 40 years goes by and you ask, what happened? um, and when my wife and I reached the age of 62, uh, I was ready to retire from the church. And I decided I wanted to go on a spiritual retreat. I wanted to confront these questions. I wanted to confront the reality that some people call God, some people call the source. In India, it's Brahman, and I wanted to wrestle with God. As a matter of fact, I even had that verse in my mind. It comes from the book of Genesis. Uh, Jacob and Esau had their falling out. The two brothers, they had falling out, and Jacob had to flee for his life. But later on in his life, he came back, and he was going to reconcile with his brother. And all that night, he was worried because he didn't know what was going to happen the next day. And so he was pacing back and forth, and he met this entity. The Bible says it was a man, but we later learned that it was what the Bible calls a theophany, a God. And the story goes that Jacob wrestled with God all night long and said, I will not let you go until you bless me. And that was the verse that was in my mind. I wanted to wrestle with God. I wanted to go on a retreat. So we came up here to the woods of South Carolina in the United States. And I built a little house, and we went on retreat. We were going to stay for 1 year. And that's going on 10 and a half, almost 11 years now. And we're still wrestling. It's still wonderful. I began to sense that something special was going on. I've got to share the story with you and with your listeners, because a couple of years ago I was asked to go to Cornwall in the UK and give a talk there about world religions. And I had never been in England before, but while I was there, I had to take advantage of the situation and go up to this little town called Fenny Compton up northwest of London. And while I was up there, I went to the church that my ancestors used to preach in. Now, this was my great, 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 great grandfather, way 400 years ago, used to preach there in that church. And I stood in the pulpit where my ancestor preached. He was a minister in the Church of England. I stood in the pulpit and I looked across the sanctuary, and there I could see the same stained glass window that he saw every day. And it was a picture of Jacob wrestling with God, saying, I will not let you go until you bless me. I'm absolutely sure that somehow his spiritual DNA was passed on to me. because that was the very same verse that I had. I wanted to wrestle with God. Now, while I was doing that, I was going back into origins, of course. When you're dealing with ancient texts, the farther I went back in ancient religious texts, whether it was from Israel or whether it was from India, or of course a lot of new information out of Turkey. Here in our own country, in the United States, the Southwest Indians, the Hopi, and some of the ancient texts in the Mayan civilizations, some of those ancient texts that come out of Peru and that come out of Central America, and even from farther south. The farther back I went, the farther back I got into the fact that no one seems to have a beginning. It's always there was somebody here before us. And that's where I began to really take an interest in lost civilizations, people, the ancients. And when I began to study them in detail, following what I think are two really great lines of evidence, their mythology and the structures they left behind. The megalithic structures, when I followed them in detail, lo and behold, I began to find a story developing that made me absolutely convinced that they were in touch with something that we have lost in this society. They had, I think, a spirituality that is so evident in their mythology and so evident in the stone structures they left behind. There was a sense of oneness. The physicists would call it entanglement, you might say, a sense of unity. So many of the same stories, so many of the same myths, so many of the same customs. And as this went on, I just became absolutely convinced that this was the direction my life had to take. So when my wife and I moved up here to the woods, lo and behold, we moved to this section of land that called us. There was no question about it. And we didn't discover for 2 or 3 years after we left here, we then discovered that there have been people on the land where we live right now, between 40 and 50,000 years. Now this flies in the face of modern archaeology here in America in the Southeast, because they say that the first Americans were only here about 12, 13,000 years ago. North America, Central America, and South America. And I just don't believe that anymore. I think they were in touch with something, and I think they have something to teach us. We have to capture it, I'm convinced. And that's a long answer to your question, but that's really what brought me out here and made me want to delve into this subject.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a really interesting story. For me, it was kind of very different, but similar in that I believe through Graham Hancock, I started getting in
Oh,
touch
yes.
with the idea of of civilization and even humanity being older than we were taught in school.
Yes. Yes.
and eventually you reach the possibility of civilization, rather than being, I don't know, 6 or 7 thousand years ago, starting twice as
Oh, at least. Yeah.
twice
Yes.
back, or perhaps even more. And you were speaking about the possibility of these people being in contact with some sort of spirituality or something that we have lost.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
what do you think could be the connection to that? Could it be in a way related to them talking in mythical ways, to them mentioning, rather than one god, different gods that were connected to certain abilities or aspects of life?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. They lived a much, much, of course, different life than we do. They had time to think, time to contemplate. And one of the things I've noticed since we've moved out here to the woods, where days go by sometimes and we simply don't see anybody, we don't hear anybody. Um, and it puts you in a different state of consciousness. And you start to hear and listen and experience and feel things that you just can't when you're involved in a busy, hectic, running around type life. I even think of my grandfather when I was very young. One of the highlights of going to visit him was that on one day of the week, he would hitch up the wagon and we to the horses, and we would go up from a little town called Tallman, Michigan. We would go to the store and shop there, and we would see people. And riding that wagon on those horses, we had time to talk, we had time to sing, we had time to think, we had time to share with one another. And I wonder about those old people, the ancients. At the end of the day, the elders would gather around a fire, say, and they would tell stories. They wouldn't go each to their own living room and turn on the television set or stare into their handheld devices or anything like that. It was just a different way of living. And I think that kind of life opens you up to what I would call the spiritual, although it's hard to find words nowadays. They carry such baggage. I'm even hesitant to use the word God because that carries so much baggage with so many people that is negative, and they may
No,
not mean the same thing that I say, you know?
the same, yeah, the same thing happens to me. uh, i in my personal practice, I'm very comfortable talking about God because I know what
Yes.
I mean, or
Yeah.
I'm not sure that I completely know what I mean, but I kind of
Yeah.
know what I mean. But
Yeah.
I'm very doubtful that when I speak the term, for example, that in the other person's dictionary it's getting
Yes.
registered in the same way,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly.
Mhm.
I think the old Hindu rishis 6,000 years ago had a great way of explaining that. When they talked about God, they used two words, Brahman and Atma.
Mm.
And in Brahman, it was that place where language cannot go. You can't describe Brahman. If you try to get it right, it turns out you're wrong because language is invented to describe a reality here, not the reality that they were talking about. So I think they were much more comfortable when they said Brahman than we are using the word God. I when I was when I was teaching Hinduism for the first time in college, I wanted to make sure I got it right for my students. And I had a friend who was from India, and he practiced a very ancient form of it. Well, Indian tradition in spirituality. He would light the candles every day, and he would say his prayers in his little shop and all this kind of thing. So I went to see him one day, and I said, I have to give a talk this afternoon. I have to talk about the concept of Brahman and Atman. And he looked at me and he smiled as he always smiled. He said, very difficult, very difficult. So I presented my lecture to him. And I told him all of the things I was going to say and tried to describe the Hindu concept of Brahman. And he looked at me and he listened to the whole thing. And I said, there, do I have it right? And he smiled and he nodded his head up and down and said, no. And I guess I didn't learn because at the end of the semester, I gave my students a test. We had to give them an exam at the end of the semester. And I said, in one paragraph, describe the Hindu concept of Brahman. One student, he was my best student, turned in a blank piece of paper. And so I was correcting all the papers that night. The next day I saw them all in class. I gave back the papers. He was sitting in the back row. He said, Professor Willis, did everybody answer question 4? And I said, the one about Brahman. And he said, yeah. I said, well, they at least tried. And he looked at me and he said, you mean I'm the only one who got it right? And I had to give him full credit for turning in a blank piece of paper because he was the only one who had the concept, including me, I might add. But the rishis went even farther, and this is what I love about it, because they also talked about Atman. And for those who are not familiar with the concept of Atman, the nearest English word that I know of that comes closest is probably soul, but it's within. And the wonderful, wonderful breakthrough that the Hindu rishis had, I think, was when they talked about Brahman and Atman. Brahman, the outer, Atman, the inner, and then they would look and they would say, thou art that. In other words, the great mystery, the glorious impossible, that which is impossible for us to understand with our minds, is within us as well. I even found it, although it hid from me in plain sight, in my own tradition. In the Old Testament Psalms and in the New Testament, the words attributed to Jesus. What? Know ye not that ye are gods? It says. It's right there in Judaism. It's right there in Christianity. The fact that we, the Atma, the spiritual soul, the essence of who we are, our consciousness, is part of the great unknown. That to me is a wonderful thing. And I think our ancient ancestors were somehow aware of this in a way intuitively, that we are not, because in our mechanistic, materialistic way, we have just lost touch with the inner sense of who we really are.
Yeah, I think we have been, in our current civilization, we have been led very much into like cattle into the stable. Like we've been led into the body or into the mind.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Even emotions is something that's kind of foreign to us. Even.
Yes.
And,
yeah.
and these ancient peoples, they were like you were saying, when they weren't working, they were in nature, communing with nature, connecting. And these rishis, probably most of the wisdom and the knowledge that they received was probably just sitting and channeling information in a way, right?
That's a great way of putting it, I think. Yeah. They had another advantage over us, and that every night they would look up into the great mystery of the skies. And their idea was to try to bring heaven down to earth, as above, so below. And nowadays, it's hard to get away from light pollution, so we don't even know what phase the moon is in. Whenever I speak in front of groups, I like to sometimes ask them, do you know what phase moon we're in right now? And very rarely do people even know that. But that great mystery of the skies. When we moved here to this piece of property, we noticed these mysterious rock piles that were put around our area where we live and around. And I knew there was something there. There was a meaning for their placement, but I didn't know what it was. I had a friend of mine who was a surveyor come over, and he gave me a half a day of his time, and we walked around, and with all of his new electronic things, he could get GPS readings for every one of these rock piles that I showed him. And then we went back to his office, and he plotted it all on a topographical map. And lo and behold, when he saw it there, we saw a perfect representation of the Northern Cross, which is, of course, in the constellation of Cygnus the Swan. Well, as soon as I had this information, I could superimpose a star map over these things, and they matched up exactly. So I quickly shot off an email to Andrew Collins, who's probably one of the great proponents today of the Cygnus the Swan and the mythology of it. And he and I developed a long-distance friendship. And he asked me a bunch of pertinent questions about whether there was any indication of a Cygnus or a bird cult in this area. And it turns out there is. There are two hawk effigy and an eagle effigy right across the river from us in Georgia. And there's no question about it that the people who lived right here were trying to bring heaven down to earth. I can almost see it on the night of the winter solstice when Cygnus the Swan is high in our sky. And if you would light fires at every one of these stone piles, you would see on earth a representation of what they saw in the heavens. And of course, the beautiful thing of that is, again, it's in all the religious traditions. In the Lord's Prayer in Christianity, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And I think these people were just really in touch with that reality that we've lost. I think we need to regain it. I really do.
Yeah. I think we've lost this connection,
yes,
or forgotten this connection, because even nowadays, thinking about these things like, bringing heaven down to earth, for example, it sounds kind of silly in our context. But for them, it was something more. I've been trying to grapple with the idea of the ego kickstarting at some point, and or the way that we speak having changed throughout time. So the way that they speak in myth, right, in the ancient past, seems like silly to us nowadays, but in a way it's an even more complex language, or a more poetic, or right, like they are getting to something behind reality through story,
Yes.
like saying something without being literal about, right? And at the
Yes.
same time, there's like both the meanings. So it's possible that they were in contact with super powerful beings that could be perfectly human or otherwise.
Mhm.
And at the same time, those stories point to our own psychology and the way that we are inside.
Yes. I agree with you 100%. I think you put it beautifully. Um, I like
Thank
to to think of it in terms of our being the Atman within, so to speak, has taken on this physical body. But that physical body is surrounded by what I call the five-fold fence, the five senses: taste and touch and smell and sight and hearing. And we live within that five-fold fence of the senses of these senses, and over the top of it is a roof, probably the intellect,
you.
that tries to make sense of it all. And we made the tremendous mistake, I think, of thinking that what is inside that fence is reality. It may be our physical reality, but it's only a reality. The real reality, I think, is outside the fence. And the ancient shaman would go in out-of-body experience. They were able to find different methods and ways to leave, to get outside that fence, to experience the reality outside of our perception realm. And then they would bring that truth back. That was their purpose of being a shaman and healer. They would bring that reality back. And I think what we need in our lifetime today are those. We should be able to train some gifted children to be able, from the very beginning, to break out of this materialistic fence and to see the reality and bring back that reality and slowly bring us along. Because I'm really convinced that the human race today stands at a crossroads. I think if we go the way of materialism, which probably has happened in the past. I'm beginning to think that the story of Atlantis has a lot to teach us about human hubris, and that if we go that way, we could just easily become another lost civilization. Thousands of years from now, they might wonder who we were. But if we go the other way, and perhaps there have been societies in the past who did this, I don't know. If we go the other way, then it opens up that greater reality and the greater spirituality. I think we're right in our lifetime. We're at a crossroads. We really are.
Yeah, in fact, I seem to notice what I'm calling some kind of a mystic revival, like
Hmm.
people becoming more in, no, I don't know if in agreement necessarily, but more feeling more comfortable with mystical ideas. And
Yes,
and you were mentioning astrology,
sure.
spirituality is coming back, meditation, yoga,
Yeah, yeah,
plant medicines, psychedelics in general. Uh,
sure.
like people are beginning to connect again with that for some reason. I don't know why it started like reviving once more. It's
Yeah.
probably some kind of a cycle that happens, and we are right in the middle of this revival, in my
Yeah,
opinion.
I think so. I had a book that was just published last December called The Quantum Akashic Field. It's a um, field guide, so to speak, for out of body travel.
Mhm.
And when I go on radio programs, live shows where people can call in, I'm always amazed when I talk about out of body experience. Even 20 years ago, people would have thought you were just crazy. But now I'm always amazed that people are calling in and they want to share their own out of body experiences with me. Most of them happen by accident or during a time of sickness or a near death experience. But more and more people, I think, are open to this and have realized that this is my experience too. It's slow, but I think you're right. I think it's happening. It's really happening.
Have you had any out of body experiences that you would like to share?
Oh, uh, too many to count.
Wow.
Probably one of the most significant out of body experiences that I can share that would, because it had an actual uh, physical result as well. Uh, when I started to have out of body experiences, and when I began to really start studying them in seriously, I went up to the Monroe Institute, founded by Robert Monroe, who is the one who actually coined the term out of body experience, OBE. And shortly uh, before and after this time, I started having epileptic seizures,
Mm.
and they were quite common. And I probably, well, if I had followed my medical advice, they would have had me go to a doctor and take medication for it. But ever since the time of Aristotle, epilepsy was called the spiritual sickness, because people with epilepsy often had visions and saw extra worldly entities or other presences around them. And it turns out that now that we know more about brain scans and MRIs and all that, that the same part of the brain that that fires up the brain scans when we do have epileptic seizures is the very same part of the brain that is most active when people go into deep meditation.
Mm.
And I didn't want to take medication to stop the epilepsy, because I thought if I took pills that got rid of the bad guys of epilepsy, I'd also be shutting out the good guys of the very out of body experiences I was going to have. But at one point in the midst of this, I lost my stability. By that, I meant I severely hurt my ankle. I think I probably broke it. I didn't go to a doctor, but I was, oh, maybe a year and a half before it was really back to normal. And this ankle was, I would continually be spraining it or stepping on it wrong. So I had to walk with a cane, and I had to wear an ankle brace. Well, one day in the midst of all this, when it was particularly hurting, I decided I wanted to go down to the medicine wheel that my wife and I built down below our house. And I was just going to meditate for a while in the gazebo that we built up on the hill. My ankle was such that I couldn't go down the hill to the medicine wheel, but I could, at least with my cane, I could hobble out to the gazebo we built, and I could sit there and meditate, looking at the medicine wheel down below me. And while I was out there, I had this vivid out of body experience where I was conscious of a group of, well, I call them wise women, shaman probably, uh, down there at the medicine wheel. And in my out of body experience, I could see myself sitting in the chair up in the medicine wheel, up above the medicine wheel, looking down and seeing the women down there. However, I had made a mistake. I had taken my cane, but I had forgotten to strap on my ankle brace. And so I, it was, it was slippery coming back and everything. And I was already thinking, oh boy, I got to get back to the house with no ankle brace on. So while I'm down there, I see these wise women at the medicine wheel, and I could see my body sitting in the chair with the leg up, and I received this summons basically to come down. Well, you have to understand, for the first 65 years of my life, I didn't believe in any of this. I thought the whole thing was crazy. But there I was. And so I went down, and I found myself laying on the ground down at the medicine wheel with these women actually putting their hands on me, and one of them especially holding my broken ankle. And I found myself saying, "It's not going to do any harm. I mean, it's not going to do me any good. The real broken ankle is up there on the hill where I'm sitting in the chair." But no, they didn't do that. They were working on that ankle, and I said, "Well, that's strange." But then I found myself being pressed somehow down into the ground. And it sounds like a terrible experience, but it was a wonderful experience. It was really joyous. And it lasted for a long time. I felt like I was in the perfect place to be. I felt comfortable. I felt these women were ministering to me in a way that, and healing me. And it was just great. Well, eventually the signal came. I knew I had to go back into my body, and I snapped back, and I found myself in the gazebo. I said, wow, that was a pretty powerful experience. I got to go back and tell my wife about that. I was halfway back to the house before I realized I was walking without the cane, and I was almost running. I got back to the house. I told my wife about it. I did this little dance around the room. My ankle was fine. You know what? I haven't had a sprained ankle since, and it's been years now. And that ankle was cured. Now, what happened? I can't explain it. I can only share what happened and know that I'm not alone in this. My wife is the witness to it. She saw the whole thing. Somehow, that out of body experience and being ministered to by this group of energy beings that I call the wise women, somehow it had an actual effect on my physical self. And I haven't had to wear an ankle brace or walk with a cane since.
Yeah, probably some kind of an instantaneous healing.
I think so. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
amazing. Yeah,
Yeah.
because I think that one of the things that we have got wrong in our society nowadays is this materialistic idea of the world, very very limited, in
Yeah.
which everything is inside the body, the physical.
Yes.
So if you were to heal in the astral plane, let's say,
Hmm.
there's no way that that could carry to the physical body, because the physical body is before. That's what
Yeah.
the common idea. But it seems to be that it's probably the other way around. So if you get a healing in one of these more subtle realms,
Hmm.
it pushes down, or yeah, let's call it push it down, but it
Sure.
comes
Sure.
towards the more gross planes. So if you that's how why it's so important for us to connect with our emotions and try to heal them and integrate them, because
Yeah.
if we do that, whatever the emotions mean metaphorically and symbolically or even mythologically, those
Yes.
those those meanings carry on and push downwards into the physical body. So if you have back pain, there's something emotional that you can work
Yeah.
on, and that will alleviate, or even in a case like yours,
Sure.
completely heal the physical ailment.
Yeah. And I think we know this on a deeper level than we realize, because when we have back pain, for instance, or somebody's bothering us, the first thing we do is say, "Get off my back." That expression.
Right.
The language itself reveals that
Mm.
we know this somehow.
Yeah, we have the intuition.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It happens in so many different ways too. If we live in fear, our bodies, I think, will show that the body follows where the intuition, where the mind, where the spirit goes. And if we allow that, especially in trying times, if we allow that kind of fear to dominate our lives, then it will, and we'll see physical effects. I'm absolutely sure of that. Yeah, I think you're right. Absolutely.
Yeah, the, mm, the idea of these subtle realms being more primary seems so strange until you start working with them, and especially until you start working within yourself, like
Yes.
looking in,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
start
I agree.
probably the rishis in India
Yeah.
did, like going deep inside, they
Hmm.
receive this knowing, right?
Yeah. 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 I know we have to be careful about this, because um, if it's too easy to give the impression that we think if a person isn't healed, we say, oh, it's your fault because you don't have enough faith, or you're not applying it, or what. And I certainly don't want to imply that.
Mm.
But on the other hand, I think there is so much truth to that. As a minister, a Christian minister for 40 years, I've had the chance to stand by the bedside of a lot of people who are dying, who have died. And a lot of times I've been there holding their hand. Um, and they talk about, for instance, seeing what they would say, some people would say an angel, or some people would say a person, or even a relative who was passed on,
Mm.
of seeing that person at the foot of the bed. Now, for so many years, because I didn't really accept this and believe it, I wouldn't negate their experience. I wouldn't say, oh, you're crazy. But on the other hand, I didn't accept it either. I thought they were just hallucinating. Now, I'm absolutely convinced that they were seeing the other side. They were seeing that presence. And that was the whole purpose of where the world's really first religious tradition, which I think is shamanism. The shamans would go to the other side, but it wasn't just an entertaining trip for them. It was something real. Their purpose was to go there and receive the understanding of what was happening in the body of their patient, and then come back. And they would often come back with a message that had nothing to do with the physical illness of their patient. They'd say, that's just a manifestation of something that else is going on in your life, and that's what you have to correct. I think one of the first things we can do with patients, for instance, who are severely depressed and severely anxious, is instead of criticizing them for it, working with them to understand the purpose. I mean, the meaning behind the depression, the meaning behind the anxiousness. And in this modern life, with so many things going on and all the connections that we have technologically and everything else, I don't think it's any question that people are probably more sicker. They're probably more depressed. There's probably more psychiatric and psychological things, because this is a very trying world to those who have forgotten that the answer is not in the body. The answer is within the heart, within the soul. Tough lesson to learn, isn't it?
Yeah, it generally takes something very challenging,
Yes.
some very challenging dark night of the soul type of event in our lives for us to start connecting with that. And maybe many people don't even that isn't enough for a few people even. And I was thinking also about the idea of this intuition that we have. You spoke about this idea of get off my back. The idea that everybody knows about of the placebo effect, it's the mind, so this very more subtle realm influencing the physical in a very even clinical setting. So
yes. I think you're absolutely right. It's probably going to be the next great step we have to take in our evolution. In one way, it's a step forward. In another way, it's a step backward to what I think the ancients once had and that we have lost. They had what I like to call a psychic toolkit, where ours is a mechanical toolkit. We're all about tools and levers and wires and all that kind of thing. They had a different way of working. And I don't think that's just a crazy idea. I think that they were literally able to manipulate their environments in ways that we just have forgotten. A great example of this, I think, was when I was over in Egypt. I was going into the pyramids, and we went deep into the pyramids, and we were walking down this long hallway that you had to bend over and stoop over to walk down the hallway. And along the edge of the pathway that we were walking, there were all these wires, these electric wires. And the purpose of them was to power the lights that had around us so we could see where we were going. Well, I wondered as I went down there, how did the original workers see to do what they were doing when they didn't have electricity? So I looked up at the walls and the ceiling, and I expected to find all kinds of smoke and soot from torches and that. There wasn't any of that. And in my reading about the pyramids, I discovered later that there never has been any indication of torches and things going into the pyramid in ancient times. So I asked the guide who was taking us down, I said, without electricity and without torches or any kind of fire-based source, how did these people see to come down here? How did they see to work down here? And the guide, the Egyptologist, just turned away from me, walked away and mumbled, well, they must have had some kind of light source. Well, obviously they had some kind of light source. What was it? And no one's been ever able to figure that out. I'm really almost forced to believe that they had some way of working in those conditions that we don't know today. I don't know what it was, but that's what I mean when I call this psychic toolkit, that they could actually manipulate material things in ways that we just don't know how to do it
The
today.
first thing that comes to my mind concerning this light source is probably an inner light source. So
Ah,
I don't know, a kind of open third eye or something that would allow them to see in 3D,
beautiful,
right?
beautiful,
But
wonderful
um,
idea. Yeah,
like
yeah,
a kind of sonar, but psychic sonar in a way.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think that's a wonderful way of putting it. I hadn't even considered that, but it makes perfect sense to me. It
Mm.
really does.
Yeah, so maybe they were like, we know there were different um, uh, mystery schools and and teachings in ancient times. So
Yes,
probably they all participated in some kind of ceremony that or 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 several number of them that
yeah,
would
yeah,
help them develop these psychic powers. You can even look at Patanjali's yoga,
yeah,
and he talks about the potential of waking your cities, right?
yeah,
And
yes,
I have experienced personally, not something extremely supernatural, but since I started along my spiritual path and doing yoga, meditation, um, and inner work, uh, I have recognized this kind of ability of, in a way, reading people,
yeah, uh-huh,
kind of psychically, but not entirely. It's more like I used to be very blocked in that
uh-huh,
sense, and
yes, yeah,
have been able to open up to a kind of instinct, So when you're connecting with somebody, you can sort of read their energy in a way.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
You
yeah,
feel it, right?
yeah,
In a way that's not easy to put in words, but it's more like a knowing or a feeling.
yeah. And isn't it interesting in our religious traditions when we talk about people seeing angels in the past, they're always described as being suffused with light, wearing the white garment or a light around them. Or in the Bible story of Moses and Jesus, rather, going up on the Mount of Transfiguration, and there he meets Moses and Elijah from Old Testament times, and the light shone. Or when Moses went into the presence of God, they saw the Shekinah glory. And even to this day, when we picture angels or beings of light, we picture them with a halo around their head, a crown of light. So I used to think that these were all just metaphors, but now I'm not so sure. I'm really beginning to wonder now if uh, the ancients were in touch with these beings of light and that could touch the inner light within all of us,
Mm.
and find that inner light. When you come right down to it, that's what we all are. We're made out of light. That's what the quantum physics would say. The quantum physicists would tell us that uh, every particle in our body really is traveling at the speed of light, so to speak. And I don't know. I think there's an awful lot to this.
Yes, and I was also thinking a little bit about the story that you told of your out of body experience. And first of all, thank you very much for sharing that. It's probably something very very personal, and thank you for having the trust, to share
This
that.
is the first time I've shared that experience publicly with you.
Uh,
You bring out the best in me. Thank you, Rafa. I
well,
appreciate
thank
it.
you, Jim, for opening up and for what you're saying. It's super exciting to hear more stories like that, and your story. First of all, it made me think of this the you called epilepsy psychic sickness, something,
Psychic toolkit. Yeah.
and
I,
and and that being like the possibility of the body, being limited in such a way that the subtle realm, when it tries to manifest through it, sometimes the body doesn't can't hold that energy, right? and
yes.
and and something goes off within our mind, and probably that's what could be happening in some perhaps cases of epilepsy, when people are um, you kind of connected it with shamanism and the idea of this kind of initiation, events that probably sometimes appear as sickness and sicknesses of the mind even, and how people can go with guidance, can go through those and awaken something
Yes.
more subtle within them, right?
Yeah. 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 And here, this leads us to something really important, I think, because anybody listening to us speak is going to be saying, I would love to live my life that way. And I don't want to for 1 minute give the illusion that I walk around all day in this great light, and everything else. Uh, I think we have to point out again and again that when we come to this life, it is because we have made what I call a very courageous decision. In the source, all is unity. In the source, all is oneness. And that's where we come from. That's where we go. The one thing that we cannot experience, though, in that unity is individuality. And so I think we make a very conscious decision to experience individuality, and we leave the source and we go to what I call the Akashic field, that great field, which is an ancient Hindu term, um, that field of every potential, every possibility. And from that field, we enter through the newly discovered Higgs field, where energy comes through the Higgs field and takes on mass, takes on uh, this material life in which we live. And that's, I think, a courageous decision. So when we experience things in life, it is because we have made that decision to do so. The trouble is that individuality and the life of duality here comes with two sides, good and bad. So when people are experiencing difficulties in their life, they always say, I'm doing something wrong. And I like to say, no, you're doing something right. That's exactly why you came. Instead of rejecting it and identifying only with the good and thinking you're only a success when you're doing the good, I think we have to identify with that bad and get in it and experience it and feel it, and because that's what we came to do. And then there will come the time when we will depart from this material reality, go back to the energy beings that we are, and take that experience with us back to the source. And the source will then have done the wonderful thing of experiencing itself. That's probably much too simplistic, but you get the idea of what I mean.
No, I don't think it's simplistic. I mean, of course, to put something so large into words, we necessarily need to narrow what it is.
Yeah.
But it's like something that I've noticed or that I've come to believe is that this separation from source, let's put it, or this separation from unity into duality, into multiplicity, I think that's one of the emotional sicknesses that's at the core of all human beings. And we talk about humanity being afraid of death, and that being the essence of our anxiety. But I think it's even deeper than that. It's not the fear of death, because in death you return to the source. I mean, Ramdas, I remember, said once, dying is like taking off a tight shoe, and that idea is pretty great. And the actual thing that I think is generating a lot of anxiety in people is this longing for God.
Yes.
What I would put it, I know, like we said earlier, the term God is kind of complicated right now, but this longing for our true essence, which is something that we've forgotten about, and which is so weird because it's always here, it's always present. I mean, there is no way you can be having your human experience if there is not your source looking through your eyes, experiencing through the five senses, right?
Yes, absolutely. I had another out-of-body experience one time when it's a very long experience. I talk about it in my book, Quantum Akashic Field, but in that experience, I found myself being taken. Well, I had just bought a bunch of property, and it was adjacent. I was going to increase my acreage, so to speak. And I was led by this guide into looking at it, and I kept on going off and into this new area that was full of being built up cities and all that kind of stuff, everything that's antithesis to what I wanted. And I found the guide leading me down into what seemed like a safe, some kind of an enclosure under the ground. And I began to get claustrophobic. And I said to this guide, a woman who was my guide there, and I was saying, "What is this place?" And she said to me, "This is where I must live when you die." And in that instant, I realized that this was a personification of my ego. Um, Now, ego is a hard word to explain, but I understood it, at least at that time, of all of the things of taking pride in the individual I was, and all of the things that take over my days. And I'm always trying to keep my ego happy, keep my ego satisfied, keep my ego fed. And I realized that when I die, that part of me that is individualized as an ego, that's going to die too. And it's that ego that is so afraid, because that ego realizes, my ego within me realizes that once I die, that ego is going to cease to exist. I will return to the source, and that ego will cease to exist. And I think when people fear death, it's their ego talking. It's that ego coming out and saying, "I am afraid because when this material world is over, my experience, my life ends." There can be no ego in source. There can be no ego in God. There can be no I in God. And so I think that's what's talking. So when people say to me that they're afraid of death, to me that shows right away that what they're basically saying is their ego wants so hard to hold on to this material reality. That's the fear that they're experiencing. And sometimes just acknowledging that makes it easier to bear it, I think.
Yeah, did you have that kind of experience when you were accompanying people that were dying?
Um, Not very often. And the reason was because I was not in a place myself. I was not spiritually grown enough to understand it. I didn't know what I was dealing with. And I had, I wish I could go back and repeat some of those experiences. I had a very good friend who was older than me. One night, in the middle of the night, I got a call from a nurse in a hospital. And he said he was dying. He wasn't expected to get through the night, and he was asking for me. So I got up out of bed and put on my clothes, got in the car, and drove to the hospital. And there in the hospital, I held his hand and I said, "Bradley, are you ready to cross over if tonight's the night?" And he started to cry. And this was a successful man. He had a couple of doctorates. He had founded a university. He had a teacher. He was a pillar of the community. He was a pillar of my church. Everybody liked him, respected him. He had made a small fortune along the way, a success in every stretch of the imagination. But here he was crying. He said, "I've done everything in my life except the one thing that was most important." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Prepare for this moment."
Mm.
And we were lucky. He made it through that night, and he made it through 10 more nights. But I spent the next good portion of every day with him for the next 10 days. I hope I was able to help him. I don't know whether I was able to give him any great help, but I know he helped me a tremendous amount, because he taught me what was most important in this life. And so whenever I find somebody worrying about something that's really trivial, I find myself saying, that's not important. What's important is to prepare for that moment when we return to the source. That's why we've come, I think.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's a great reflection.
Yeah.
We are so worried with the daily minutia, like I say,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and we lose sight, we lose we lose context of the bigger picture, right?
Sure. Sure. Yeah. 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 Well, oh, it's so wonderful to be able to talk with someone about these things. I really appreciate it, Rafa. It's been a great to be with you, to talk to you with this
Yeah,
thing.
yeah, it's been beautiful for me also, Jim. I really appreciate you. Well, like uh, opening up, of course, with all your personal stuff. And
Well, thank you. I hope we can do it again soon. This was fun.
wow, thank you very much. I would also really appreciate um, talking again, getting deeper into old civilizations and deeper into all these subtle realms, and talking
Yes,
about all of the mystical aspect of life. So, well,
sure.
Jim, thank you very much. Please let us know, let our audience know where they can find you in social media or your books.
Sure. Sure. I love when people contact me, and probably the easiest way is to go to my website, which is www.jimwillis.net. That's JIMWILLIS.net. And that lists all my books. I also have a Facebook page, although I must commit I don't do a lot on Facebook, but I have a Facebook page that announces things that are coming out. I also have a YouTube channel that where I do some reading and some singing and some lecturing and things like that. So that's out there too. But probably the easiest thing is go to jimwillis.net, and there's a contact page. Drop me an email. I would love to hear from you.
Very good. How can we find your YouTube? I'm very interested in taking a look at that.
Well, if you go to YouTube and then search for, probably the easiest thing is to do something like, oh, Jim Willis, Wonderful World. It's a Wonderful World, or something like that. I sing that one of my favorite songs. It's a Wonderful World, but it lists all the other things. There's some readings, and there's a lecture on dowsing that I gave at the Society for the American Dowsing Society. But Jim Willis, What a Wonderful World will take you to that page.
All right, perfect. Well, Jim, thank you very much. It was a really great pleasure to meet you and have a chance to speak with you.
Thank
Let's
you.
do it soon.
Thank you, Rafa. We will, for sure.
All right. Bye bye.
Bye now. We'll see you.